There are four types of for loops in JavaScript. The first type is a classic for loop. In this type, you define a variable, then you increment that variable. In this type of loop, you can use break and continue statements within the loop. The second type is a forEach loop. The only thing to remember here is you cannot use break and continue. Also, in the forEach loop, it doesn't make any sense to use a return when you use within a function, because it'll just return you back into the forEach loops and it'll continue running. The third type is a for-in loop, which works very well with objects, but doesn't work that well with arrays. And the fourth type is a for-off loop. The for-off loop works with arrays, strings, any built-in types in JavaScript like map, set, which are iterable. Whereas for types like objects, which are not iterable, it doesn't work. So let's try the first type of loop. So we have an array of numbers. So in this type of loop, we'll create a variable first, which will run as long as it is less than the length of the array. Then we increment the variable, and let's console log the values by grabbing the array and passing the increment. So if we run this, we get all the values in the array. Let's see how we could use break and continue within this loop. So for break, basically meaning it'll just break out of the loop without running that particular iteration. So if I equal to 3 and I break, I never get to 50 because that's the last value, which is I equal to 4. So let's also see how we can use a continue. So continue basically means it'll ignore anything that is below that statement and go back and run it again. So if I put the console log, it didn't work because it needs to go below the continue statement, and run it again, it will never print value 40 because 0, 1, 2, 3. When it hits 3, it ignores 40, doesn't print it, goes back to the start of the loop and runs again. Also, let's see how we can use this loop within a function. So the benefit of using this loop is we can use a return statement, which I mentioned earlier. Return statement doesn't work for forEach, but for this type of loop, the classic for loop, if I say return, it basically will exit the loop. So if I run this function, it should only print first value 10, and then it hits return statement, exits the loop. Okay, let's look at the forEach loop next. The forEach loop can be called directly from the array. So if I say nums, the forEach method is available there. And then I can grab the item, and then I can console log that item. So pretty much similar to the result we get for the other loop, but way easy to write. Like I mentioned, you cannot use break. So if I try to use break, and if I show you the errors, it says break is not available. So like I mentioned, we cannot use break or continue within a forEach loop. That could be a drawback, because though there are situations when we want to use both of these statements. The forEach loop accepts 3 parameters. So we have seen the item. It can also take an index as well as the array, which will come very handy to know this when we create our own custom for loop. So it still works when we pass those 3 parameters. But now what I can do is I can also grab the index. And if I print that, it prints the values and the index of the array. So moving on, let's comment the array and let's see how we can loop over an object. So let's create an employee object and give it some properties. First name, last name, and so let's say if I want to loop over this object and I want to use the off loop for, let's start with the off loop, because we know this doesn't work. This is the option 4. It only works on iterable objects. So let's see what do we get. So we get an error. Employee is not iterable. So that's not going to work. So let's see if the rest operator works, because we saw that rest operator also doesn't work on objects which are not iterable. So let's create a REST operator and try to console log the values. And again, we get the same error. So obviously the off loop and the REST operator doesn't work on objects because they're not iterable. But let's see if they work on the array. So if I pass the array to the REST operator, and there you go, it works because array, like strings, is iterable. So anything which is iterable, the REST operator and the off loop will work. So if I try the off loop on the array, and there we go. So that works. So now we are just left with the objects and we haven't found a way how to iterate over it. So that's where the option 3, the in loop, comes in. So if I comment this out and let's bring the object back, and to iterate over this, I'll now use the in loop and then I pass in the object and there we go. So now I can iterate over the object properties by using the in loop. So this gives me the property names, or I can even grab the object and pass the item like that and get the actual values as well. Okay, so let's see how we can create our own custom for each loop. So let's uncomment the nums array. So we saw before, to use the for each loop, we can call it directly from the array like that. And then it accepts 3 parameters, item, index, and the array. And using the arrow function, we can just grab hold of the actual value of the array. And that's all it does. Now to create our own custom for each loop, let's create a function and call it my for each, just to distinguish it from the for each available out of the box. It accepts 3 parameters, array and my callback, which is a callback function. We haven't defined it yet. And then we use the classic for loop. So the interesting thing here is the for each loop also uses the classic for loop under the hood, and that's all we're doing. So when we call my for each loop, it'll actually use the classic for loop, and then it'll iterate over the array, and in each iteration it'll call a callback function, pass in the value of the array, the index, and the array itself. And then we can define what we want to happen in that callback function. So let's define the callback function. It's a constant, my callback. And this will accept the item, the index, the array, the 3 parameters. And then we can decide what we want. So in this case, we just want to print the value. But as you can see, this shows that the for each available out of the box also uses the classic for loop. So if I call this my for each function and pass in the nums array and my callback function, and there you go, it just prints exactly the same thing as a out of the box for each loop. So it takes the array, runs through the for loop, and then one by one it calls the callback function and then prints the items. Okay, so we also saw that the for each loop was available within the array, but can we call, so like that, we saw that the for each loop was available, but can we call my for each loop as well from the array? So let's try that. So my for each item, and let's try to console log item, because we have defined our own for each loop, so we should be able to call it from the array. And let's comment that out and let's run that, and we get an error. My for each is not a function, so it's not available within the array. To understand why that is the case, let's go to the Chrome snippets. So it's just in the Chrome console, and let's create a nums array in here, and let's call the for each, and let's try to console. So we've seen this already, that this will print the value of the array. So if I just run that, we can see that we've seen that working before. So now what I'll do is I'll add this to the watch. So you can select the variable and add it to the watch, or you can type it under the watch and add the variable like that. So what I want to show you here is that if we expand the nums array, so let me just zoom in. So if we expand the nums array, we have this prototype property available from the nums array pointing to an array. And if we scroll down this property, we have all these different methods available. And we have a forEach method available here. So this is the reason we can select an array and call the forEach method from it, like nums.forEach. But nowhere in this list we have the myForEach method. This was the custom myForEach that we created. And that's the reason we got the array when we tried to call myForEach from the nums. That method is just not available. To understand what's going on, we have to understand a concept called prototype chain. The nums array we saw has a property available called prototype, which points to an array, and all the methods we saw were all available within that array. And one of those methods was a forEach method. Hence, when we call nums.forEach, though the forEach method is not directly available in the nums array, it is available up the prototype chain. It is available in the array object. Array itself has a property which points to the object. And any methods available on the object will then become available to the array. Instead, it will become available to the nums. An object in turn has a prototype property, and on it goes. It goes on till the prototype property points to null, and that's where the prototype chain ends. So this is an important concept. So as long as a method is available somewhere up the prototype chain, we can use that method. So the challenge for us is, how can we add our own custom forEach loop up this prototype chain, and where can we add it so we can directly call it from the nums array? And that is easier than it sounds because of a concept called prototypal inheritance. So if you come from classic languages like Java and you're familiar with classic inheritance, this in JavaScript, it's a similar concept, though you can also use classic inheritance in JavaScript, and we'll probably discuss it in some other video. But with the prototypal inheritance, the main points to remember is every object in JavaScript has a built-in property called prototype. We saw that with nums. We saw that with array. The prototype itself can have its own prototype, making a prototype chain. Chain ends when we reach a prototype that has null for its own prototype. So now what we'll see is how to add myForEach to this prototype chain. Okay, so for that, let's bring the code back that we wrote to create our own custom forEach. Let's add the nums back to the watch. We'll remove the old one. Let's run this. Okay, so let's look up the prototype chain. And as we can see, the myForEach we confirmed is not available. Okay, so to add it, all we need to do is, so we'll get rid of this function and create it from scratch. Leave our callback function because we'll need it. Then we'll say array.prototype, name of our forEach, myForEach, and then we'll create a function, pass in the callback function to this, and then we'll use the for loop. Exactly similar to what we did before. I've just written it in a different way, so it may look different, but it's exactly the same way how we constructed our forEach before. The only difference is this time we are actually assigning this function over to array.prototype.myForEach. And here, the main thing to note is this refers to the array itself. So when I say this – this is actually referring to the array. Okay, so now if let's just add it back to the watch and let's run it again. And we can see now my forEach is available. Okay, so that's what the goal was. So now that means I can then go to nums and call, I can still call forEach. Okay, so that's not affected. The out of the box forEach still works. But let's now test our own forEach. So nums dot my forEach item and then console log and get rid of that and save it and let's run it again. There we go. So that shows that my forEach loop is now working and can be called directly from the array. And let's console log my forEach just to make sure it is not running the out of the box forEach, but it's running a custom one. And there we go. Let's go back to our VS Code and focus on forOff loop. So let's get rid of all of this, comment the array, uncomment the object. So we discussed that forOff loop doesn't work on anything which is not iterable. Any object which is not iterable, forOff loop or even the rest operator is not going to work. So if we do something like let item of employee, because employee object is not iterable, we going to get an error. So let's try to run it again just to recap. And there we go. We get the error employee is not iterable. So that means that employee object cannot be directly passed into the for loop. But what we can do is something like this, object dot keys. So we're still using the forOff loop, but rather than passing the employee object directly, we're using the object dot keys on the employee object and then grabbing the value of the employee object, and then we can print out the key and the value, which is going to give us all the properties and the values of those properties. So we can still use the off loop, we just can't use it on the object directly as the object is not iterable. We have another option. We can also destructure the property values and use something like object.entries and destructure the property and the value right there and then get the property. So it's a slightly easier way to get the same result. And if we run this, we get the properties and the value. So the challenge before us is how to make the object, in our case, the employee object, iterable. So as long as we can make the employee object iterable, we will be able to pass it directly to the forOff loop and get the result that we are after. So when we look at the MDN documentation, we see in order to make an object iterable, we have to implement the Iterable protocol as well as the Iterator protocol against the object. So once we implement these two protocols for an object, the object becomes iterable. So in the Iterable protocol, we must implement a property either on the object or somewhere up the prototype chain, which should be available via the constant symbol.iterator. So that property should be available via this constant against the object to implement the Iterable protocol. So let's write that down as one of the first steps we have to do to make the employee object iterable. So let's get rid of that. And the first thing we have to do is if employee object implements symbol.iterator constant, that would then make the employee object iterable. So that's half the job done. Now the Iterator protocol also states that the object must implement the next method, which in turn should return an object with two properties. So the two properties that the object should return is a Boolean, which could be true or false, and the actual value. So let's write that down. So as a second step to implement the Iterator protocol, we have to do is the object must implement the next method and then returns us an object with two values. So the two values are done, which is a Boolean, and the actual value. So that's the way to make an object iterable. In order to drive this point home, what we just learned is that in order to make our employee object iterable, we have to implement two protocols. An iterable protocol, which states that the object must return an iterator via a constant called symbol.iterator. And the second condition is the object should also implement a next method and return an object with the done and value properties in order to become an iterator. And once both the iterable and the iterator protocols are satisfied on an object, the object can then be used directly in the for/of loop or the rest operator because the object becomes iterable. So that indicates that the built-in types, which can directly out of the box be used in the for/of loop, like arrays, maps, strings, we don't have to do anything with these types. We can just directly use them in the for/of loop. That means these types are already iterable and they already implement the iterable and the iterator protocol. So next we'll see how to implement the iterable and the iterator protocol for our employee object, and that will give us insight how these other built-in types implement these protocols. In the VS Code, so what we'll first do is we'll create the next method, and we'll also add the symbol.iterator property. Now these are the two conditions that we have to meet. Now let's go back to our console. So in the next method, first thing we'll do is we'll grab the values of this object. So we'll grab the values of any object. It could be, in our case, it's an employee object, but it could be any object. We'll also just create a variable. This is a variable that we'll use to iterate over the properties of the object. So what we have to say is that as long as our variable, which is I in this case, is less than the length of the properties of the object. So this will mean that iterate over the first name, last name, department, but don't iterate over the next. We're not concerned with next. Next is just a means to an end. And then the condition was we have to return an object with two properties, done, which is a Boolean. So in first case, the done is false because we want to keep iterating over this object till we are at the last property, which in this case is a department. And once we have reached the last property that we are interested in this case, the department, we'll return an object with done equal to true, which will then terminate the iterator. So we have done that. And then in the symbol.iterator property, we return this iterator. In this case, we're returning this object. So now, if we run this, basically what we have to now test is, does this make the employee object iterable? So let's try that. So let's try the console log item, and we get an error. So, oh, sorry, this should be our employee object. Okay, so let's try that again. Okay, there we go. And that means we have now been able to use the employee object directly in the for/of loop. And that means we have successfully implemented both the iterable and the iterator protocols. Okay, so now let's try the rest operator, because last time we tried the rest operator, we also got the same error that the employee object is not iterable. So if we print that, we get the results back. So what happens if we now try to run both the for/of loop and the rest operator together? So the for of loop runs finds and returns a value, but for the rest operator, we get an empty array. And that's because we implemented the next method and the symbol.iterator property within the object, which results in the iteration state being shared. So the for of loop runs fine. And because the iteration state is shared, the iterator has already reached the end of line. And by the time the rest operator is run, we get an empty array. Now, it's very rare that we'll ever run multiple for of loops together like that, but there is a solution to this issue, which is that we implement the iterator separate. And for that, what we have to do is take the symbol.iterator property out of the object and implement the next function separately. So exactly the same, nothing changes here. All we're going to do is we now have the symbol.iterator property added to the employee object, and then that points to the function which returns us the same next method. And I think that's all we need to do. So just tinkering there. Okay, so we'll can get rid of the next method from the employee object, and then we add the symbol.iterator property. And let's try to run both these loops. Let's try the first one to see whether it still works. Yep, still works. And if we try to run the for of loops together, we get the right result. So we have removed the dependency of a shared iteration. Let's look at another example to make this concept concrete. And this time we'll create an object, and let's call it range. And the purpose of this object is that it returns us values from the start till the finish. So the start is 1, finish is 100, and we want this object to return us all the values from the start to the finish and all the ones in between. And this is where we can make this object iterable by implementing the Iterable and the Iterator protocol, just similar to how we handle this in our employee object. We'll create a next method, and all we are saying here is keep iterating over this object till the start is less than equal to finish. Basically, we want the values returned from 1 to 100. And once you're done with that, then return us back an object with the done equal to false, or done equal to true, sorry. So, and the next thing we have to do is implement the symbol.iterator constant, which just returns us the object. And if we try to run this, and print that, we get all the values returned from 1 to 100. So this is just another use case, and we can see that making objects iterable can be put to various different use cases. Okay, let's keep going and look at our nums array again. So we said that the array is out of the box type, which is already iterable, and the documentation states that in order to get hold of the iterator from the array, we can use various different methods on the array. For example, nums.values returns the iterator, and we can use this iterator to then get the values, get hold of the values. So if I print iterator.next, this will return me the first value of the array. So let's run that. It returns the value 10 and done equal to false, because we are not finished with the array. And if I run the statement, let's say 5 more times, what we'll see is we'll print all the values of the array, and at the last line we'll get the value equal to undefined and done equal to true. And this is how we implemented the next method as well as the symbol.iterator property in our object. So this is doing exactly the same thing. And for other out-of-the-box types, we can also achieve the same result. For example, string. Now string is also an out-of-the-box type which is iterable, and we know that because we can use the string directly in the for of loop and then print the string like that. And if I run that, it'll give me all the characters in that string. So because it's already iterable. So just like with the arrays, we could grab hold of the array iterator. We can do the same for the string as well. So we can create a constant, let's call it string iterator. And to get hold of the string iterator, we'll have to pass the symbol.iterator property, which is what we used to make the employee object iterable. So then to grab hold of the first character, I can use the .next method. And if I run that, I get the first character. The benefit of this is that I can then modify this iterator behavior. For example, I can use the while loop and can get hold of the string iterator .next, which will give me the object, which is both value and done. And to break out of the while loop, I'll say if item.done, which means once item.done is true, it will break out of the loop, and then I can grab hold of the actual character of the string using item.value like that, and need to use break there, otherwise the while loop will keep running. And then I can modify the value returned by the iterator. So I can add some extra characters to it, or I can put some logic around it, what's actually returned. So it's really powerful to be able to modify the iterator and return values from it. So as we saw that we can grab hold of the array iterator, string iterator. So when it comes to our employee iterator, which we implemented ourselves using the Iterable and the Iterator protocol, that means we can grab hold of the employee iterator as well. And as we saw that employee iterator is available in the symbol.iterator property. And just like the string, we can also grab hold of the employee iterator with the symbol.iterator property, then can use the while loop like we saw with the string to modify the iteration behavior. So not only we can make an object iterable, we can also grab hold of that iterator against the symbol.iterator property and modify the iteration behavior. Hope this has been helpful and provides some insight into how the for loops work under the hood. Thank you.